Okay, so our second presentation of the day from Martin Nord is about the United Church of Canada's reconciliation documents and the indexing of collective memory by Martin Nord from Western University. Martin, go ahead.
All right, thank you. So I want to start by acknowledging that London, where I am, is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewick, and Attawandaron peoples on lands connected with the London Township and Sombra Treaties of 1796, and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. With this, I respect the longstanding relationships that Indigenous nations have to this land, as they are the original caretakers. I acknowledge historical and ongoing injustices that Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit endure in Canada, and I accept responsibility as a member of a public institution to contribute toward revealing and correcting miseducation, as well as renewing respectful relationships with Indigenous communities through my teaching, research, and community service. Okay. So, a distinct approach in the field of knowledge organization views indexes as part of the process and structure of our daily lives, rather than as the traditional alphabetical and hierarchical techniques on which our field so often focuses, including back of the book indexing, concordances, subject headings, descriptive cataloging, metadata, thesauri, and citation indexing. These techniques traditionally follow a specific pattern because indexes lead from, quote, a known order of symbols to an unknown order of information, unquote. At the same time, an index's function is limited to the matching of information to information seekers. Outside of this traditional LIS context, scholars have identified ways in which individuals who are not necessarily functioning as information seekers use representations to similarly orient themselves to the phenomena in the world around them. This opening up of information, and especially of documents, to a wider range of forms began, at least for my purposes, in 1951 with Suzanne Brier's What is Documentation? Michael Buckland's influential articles on the nature of information and documents brought Brier's ideas to a wider audience. This distinctive path is clearly articulated in Ron Day's 2014 book, Indexing It All, wherein he, quote, examines the transition of indexes from being explicit professional structures that mediate the relation of user needs and documentary information in seeking, searching, and retrieving to being implicit infrastructural devices in everyday information and communication acts, unquote. The dimensions of indexing, thus, have broadened considerably. With a broader perspective comes the possibility for questions set in new contexts. One such set of questions that has emerged involves the relationship between indexing and memory in communities. Jeffrey Bowker, for example, describes how scientific communities index their past with information technologies in order to remember them. In a parallel approach, Aviatar Zerubbabel believes that, quote, the social nature of human memory is evident not only in the actual content of our recollections, but also in the way that they are mentally packaged, unquote. So, drawing on these two emerging themes, I argue in this paper that one of the implicit infrastructural devices in our everyday information and communication acts, to echo Day, is collective memory. Before I move on to that analysis, however, I want to provide a bit of background about how I arrived at these ideas. The research I am talking about today is part of a much larger project in which I am studying how documents influence individuals as they position themselves in the world as moral selves, specifically in response to cultural genocide. To provide focus for this study, I identified a case study of documents that were explicitly tied to the ethical problem of experiencing and responding to others. These documents are created and used by the United Church of Canada, or the UCC, in its reconciliation work with Indigenous peoples. Because it ran 15 residential schools, the UCC was party to the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement in Canada, and thus was formally called upon by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to account for its role in what the Commission described as a process of cultural genocide. This accounting and the reconciliation work that responds to it actually started long before the TRC came into being. The UCC apologized to Indigenous peoples in 1986. In the 34 years since that event, the UCC's narrative about itself has shifted. Settler colonialism was always an unspoken part of the church's identity, but since the apology, settler colonialism has become an active part of its narrative. By settler colonialism, I am referring here to the process by which an exogenous or outside group aims to locally and permanently replace the indigenous groups. So the X in exogenous there is the opposite of the in indigenous. As part of that larger project, I have been researching the reactions to these case study documents across time, as seen in the United Church of Canada archives in Toronto and the collections of Huron University College and St. Peter's Seminary in London, Ontario. I looked at the records of the church's moderators and of the general council meetings, committee reports, and correspondence from members of congregations concerning the church's apology. I also studied the three main periodicals related to the UCC, so the Observer, Gathering, and Mandate, to get a sense of the public communication surrounding the documents. As I moved through all these records, I perceived the indexical structure I will describe as collective memory. I noticed that the church's 1986 apology to Indigenous peoples played a special role, not just in the life of the church, but in the life of the case study documents. The two could not be separated, and not just because the apology was historically significant. Rather, the apology was repeatedly built into the narrative the church was using to identify itself to the world. It was documented, copied, and distributed, and that was referenced in many of the other documents used by the UCC to encourage reconciliation. Though I did not immediately know how to frame this phenomenon, I knew it had something to do with aboutness and indexing based on the rest of my work. And so I was left with some questions about what indexing was in this situation. What here was aboutness? What form were these things taking, and what did it mean for them to take these forms? I do want to address these questions, but because I honed in on the collective memory dynamic before I could articulate its connection to indexing and aboutness, I am going to follow that same trajectory as I continue to move through this paper. As I already indicated, I found that my case study documents echoed the apology, repeatedly pointing to the event to reinforce it while allowing for a nuanced narrative to form around it. Two aspects of this phenomenon emerged as important considerations for my framing of the indexing as related to collective memory. First, the apology in its originating moment was an event, not a document. This was a clue that this was not just a matter of a subject being referenced across the literature. And this leads to the second aspect. The apology became not just a part of the written record, it became an active part of the church's narrative. In both cases, event and narrative, we have some of the key ingredients for collective memory. And by collective memory, I should clarify that I am referring to the idea that a community's shared historical consciousness plays an important role in a variety of political, economic, and cultural processes. Collective memory is often is founded on pivotal events or ideas, and the 1986 apology to Indigenous peoples is that kind of pivotal event. What makes it different from history itself is that collective memory is narrative in nature. It does not just point back to the event in its historic context. I get this sense of collective memory from philosopher Paul Ricoeur. He describes the relationship between narratives and real life in this way. Narratives are not real life, which does not follow neat narrative structures. However, narratives represent real life, and their basic structure, beginning, middle, and end, is able to approximate the temporal arc within which all human action occurs. My research indicates that the UCC's documents contribute to collective memory through a four-stage process. In the first stage, the phenomenon of the event was captured in the form of a document. The apology was delivered in 1986 as part of the UCC's annual General Council meeting, held that year at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. Moderator Bob Smith read the apology to a group of Indigenous peoples waiting beside a sacred fire. In that very first official moment, the apology was read from a piece of paper. In other words, the event and the document were in many ways simultaneous phenomena. This was the moment of indexing in the larger world context mentioned earlier. The document now represents or stands in for the original phenomenon. In the second stage, the document goes through a document life cycle, similar to Theodore Schellenberg's record life cycle, as it is referenced, compiled, reformatted, copied, distributed, or preserved. Throughout the cycle, the indexed phenomenon is passed through space and time as it moves within this continuum, changing slightly with each new iteration. These new iterations include the cairn that marks the place at which the apology was delivered, and plaques, in addition to the paper and digital document forms of the apology, not to mention the numerous references in other documents. In the third stage, individuals have opportunities to encounter each iteration. They encounter these iterations or secondary documents in a variety of contexts that are far from the apology's temporal spatial origin in 1986 Sudbury. Each new encounter reinforces the centrality of the apology to the UCC's story. Finally, in the fourth stage, individuals process these encounters according to their own identities. The secondary document itself, the context of the encounter, and the context brought to the encounter by the identity interact and negotiate in this stage to prompt individuals to adjust their own narratives, either reinforcing the individual's connection to the UCC through a reinforced narrative, or renegotiating the connection so as to differentiate the individual from the UCC. This is a complex step that depends on how individuals tell their own stories. As a concrete example of how these four stages play out, let me point to the cairn. We already know the apology was captured in the form of a document in the first moment. In the second stage, the cairn was conceived of and built as a complex amalgam of various simultaneous stages of a document life cycle. So let me explain that in more detail. The cairn was built out of rocks that the presidents of the UCC conferences were asked to bring from their home conferences to the 1986 General Conference, an action not related to the apology at that time. The cairn therefore references the apology, reformats the apology into a new material form, and preserves it in this constructed stone form. The cairn also compiles, being built not only out of the rocks that were part of the 1986 General Conference, but also in the floor and outer circle of the overall structure, out of stones from the Shegang and Whitefish River First Nations. In the third stage, individuals have opportunities to encounter this new iteration of the apology. Its October 1988 dedication was filmed and shown in the first Spirit Connection broadcast. It has become a regular stop on the tour of new clergy around the Manitou Conference. It is also where the Reverend Louise Cummings was installed as president of Manitou Conference in 1991. The cairn has also been the site of at least 3 anniversary services, marking the 10th, 25th, and 30th anniversaries of the apology. And it has also served as the site of the All Native Circle Conference, or the ANCC. Individuals also encounter the cairn as it develops over time. For instance, at the gathering of the UCC's All Native Circle Conference just mentioned, delegates added stones brought from their own areas to the cairn. In the fourth stage, individuals process their own encounters with the cairn according to their own identities. Because this happens on an individual level, I can't comment on this in the same way. However, the church provides some important prompts to guide this processing. For example, the cairn was intentionally left incomplete to represent the ongoing work that follows from the apology. The cairn is also accompanied by 2 plaques, one of which acknowledges the red rock from the Whitefish River First Nation that was used for the floor of the cairn. The other plaque tells the story of the cairn and the meaning of the structure in English, French, and Anishinaabemowin. Sorry for the pronunciation there. In all of this, the apology does not pass through space, but it does pass through time. As I move through this example of the cairn, you might have noticed a few characteristics of the process that I think correspond to the characteristics of documents and collective memory. First, the process anchors the originating phenomenon in the world. As a physical manifestation of the phenomenon, documents create the possibility for encountering it and guarantee that it can be referenced. So in the case of the cairn, both the site and the message of the apology are anchored in stone. Second, you should notice that it is the interplay between a phenomenon and a group of documents that contributes to collective memory. A group of documents positioned around a single phenomenon repeats the reference multiple times, filling in the stages of its narrative arc. With the cairn, we have the cairn itself, which is then explained in plaques and then added to at the gathering of the ANCC. The group of documents that develops around the cairn is itself only a subset of the much larger group of UCC documents that follow in the footsteps of the apology. Third, collective memory often involves an interplay between event and document. The apology moved from event into document and back into event numerous times. Each movement was tied to a new document life cycle, each cycle reinforcing the church's narrative. With the cairn as our example again, we are reminded of the original site and event of the apology, which itself started as writing on paper. The cairn then goes on to become the site of numerous services and events, some of which are tied directly back to the apology. Others, like the ANCC gathering, are closely related. Each of these events leads to the new documents. The group of documents that develops around the cairn is itself only a subset of the larger collection in the UCC. Finally, we can see that collective memory has a flexible nature involving both stability and evolution. This is closely tied to its narrative structure, which ensures that the overall story remains the same, even as elements of a story, such as sequence or character, are framed in a new light. The documents ensure continuity by continuously orienting the community towards a common phenomenon. Simultaneously, the documents ensure that a variety of perspectives, details, and interpretations of the apology continue to come to light. The most obvious ways in which the cairn displays this characteristic is in its intentionally unfinished construction. The sense of ongoing reconciliation work was not so explicit in the original apology. It is also evident in the second plaque added after the dedication that lays out the UCC's own interpretation of the cairn's meaning. Now, if you've followed me this far, you may understand the ways in which I am tying documents to collective memory, but perhaps the indexing and aboutness aspects have not been as clear. Let me turn back to what indexing and aboutness are and how they fit into the narrative that has formed around the UCC's apology. These are still connections that I am working through, so if anybody has insights for me after the paper, I am very happy to have a conversation about them. In general, I believe that aboutness implies indexing. LIS has traditionally assumed that this implication led to strict hierarchical categorizations. I think the case study indicates that indexing could and does take other forms, and this has important implications for aboutness. In this discussion concerning aboutness and indexing, which are complex topics, I want to use Jonathan Ferner's identification of identity as the core concern of knowledge organization. According to Ferner, knowledge organization uses aboutness and relevance to produce identity. The aim of indexing, in other words, is to achieve consistency between these aboutness judgments and relevance judgments. This consistency is identity, according to Ferner. The indexer's representation of reality is supposed to correspond to the index user's representation of reality. Where I find Ferner's discussion to be most helpful is where he broaches the idea that personal and social identities, quote, cannot be represented by simple hierarchical class divisions, unquote. Ferner discusses numerous kinds of identities to illustrate the complexities involved. And it is significant that one of these identities is diachronic, so it ties into memory. In other words, identity can change over time. Philosopher Stephen Yablo, writing about aboutness at the sentence level, provides insight into that relationship between aboutness and complexity when he recognizes that, quote, truths come to us wrapped in larger falsehoods that go beyond what we really wanted to say, unquote. Whereas Diablo thinks about how we should start with the literal content of an assertion and expand or contract it to what we actually want to say, indexers, in our field in general, still tend to organize the relationship between aboutness and relevance in a hierarchical way. Ferner is focused on the knowledge organization approach to identity and indexing. Yet he recognizes that in this approach, many of the dynamics that became apparent in my archival research of the UCC documents. At first glance, my case study documents were indexed in a fairly standard knowledge organization way and display the exact problems that Ferner mentioned, because the UCC tagged the documents aboutness first as Aboriginal and then Indigenous. However, the documents are very rarely about Indigenous individuals. They are more often related in some way to issues of concern to Indigenous peoples or to attempts to recognize Indigenous spirituality. In other words, the aboutness in the case study documents is more often the UCC's attempts to be a reconciling church. Aboutness is still matched to relevance, identity is still the goal, and diachrony plays a very important role still. Yet no one, at least officially, has indexed this relationship. In fact, if in knowledge organization documents are acted upon by indexes, I propose that documents here become the index. Consistency also changes form because judgment, once enacted on aboutness by the indexer, does not have the same force. The UCC as an institution does still organize the case study documents, thinking it is providing access to the Indigenous subject, but in fact, the church as a community is providing access to its own aboutness, which now takes the form of a narrative identity determined by so it takes the form of a narrative identity as a reconciling church. Likewise, relevance also takes the form of narrative identity, determined now by whether the documents help individuals to position themselves either as more in or less in the community. Aboutness and relevance, to some extent, collapse into themselves as consistency becomes individual membership in the community. Ferner's identity actually becomes identity here, but without the same sense of judgment and having to match across hierarchical classes. This reflects the movement of indexing to larger world contexts mentioned at the beginning of this paper. However, it also complicates how we think about documents as infrastructural devices in our everyday lives. I do not want to overstate this, but I do have a sense that some writers in the school of thought see structures as threatening to determine every aspect of our lives, such that, quote, increasingly and unceasingly in modernity, we are faced with communication and information technologies and techniques that reconfigure or obliterate the site specificity and time-valued materiality of persons, events, and objects by a modern conception of information, unquote. There is some truth to this, but my research indicates that other forces like collective memory, even as they have their own problems, draw attention back to the site-specific, time-valued materiality of persons, events, and objects. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Martin, for this very fascinating talk. Do we have questions in the chat or in person for Martin? If so, please feel free to jump in and ask or raise your hand. It's really up to you. If not, I have something that came to my mind. This is not really my area, so forgive me if I'm asking questions, but and it's the very last thing that you were mentioning, and I wonder if you could say something about that. It's how, if I understood correctly, what you're saying is that through its the UCC documents basically are an attempt by an organization or to reconstruct some sort of narrative that position themselves within, like, just actually it's self-serving attempt to put to position themselves in a certain way into the global narrative. And then, if I understand, then are you suggesting that our collective memory is basically a tool that can protect us from being sort of manipulated by this kind of like informational attempts from powerful or groups to shape our thinking about our lives in the world? So it's maybe a bit confusing. Maybe you can make sense of that question. Sorry. Yeah.
No, I think that makes sense. And okay. Yeah, I think basically you're right. I mean, I guess on the one side, I don't know that how intentional collective memory always is. So like, I think the church is constructing this index, like this narrative about themselves. But I don't know that they're always aware of the ways in which they're doing it, because with these documents in particular, they always have reconciliation in mind. And so they're thinking about, I believe that they're thinking about Indigenous people and responding to them. And they aren't necessarily thinking about what this says about them and how it affects how people belong to their community. But I think that's part of what happens in here. And then for the other part of your question, I think, you know, collective memory isn't completely separate from like all the like technological thinking and everything that goes into ICTs. There are ways they are connected, but in the way that it helps to understand how our individual identities develop as part of our communities, I think it does help to differentiate ourselves from these kind of larger dynamics that as we kind of get these, I don't know, like monocultures or these standardizing sort of effects in society at a broader level. So I do think there is some level of I don't know if protection is the right word, but like there's a way to differentiate yourself that I think that is important there. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah, that's great. We might have, well, actually we're out of time, but if there's another quick question, we can take it. If not, well, thank you, Martin, for this position. It was great.